So without any further ado, it's now time for me to introduce our speaker for today. Our topic is a very timely one: U.S. Middle East policy pre-post Hamas war. And we're fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Natan Sachs. He is the director of the Center for Middle East Policy and a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy program at Brookings. He has taught as an adjunct professor at Georgetown's Department of Government and in its Security Studies program. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Sachs was a Fulbright Fellow in Indonesia, a visiting fellow at Tel Aviv University's Center for Middle East and African Studies, and a fellow at Stanford's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Dr. Sachs is an expert on Israeli foreign policy, its domestic politics, and on U.S. policy towards the Middle East. His writings have appeared in such publications as Foreign Affairs,
Recording in progress.
The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, New York Times Global, and others. He has a forthcoming book which describes the aftermath of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, the dangers of both a one-state agenda and anti-solutionism, and recommends policy for promoting a more peaceful and just relationship among Israelis and Palestinians. Dr. Sachs has provided testimony before Congress and has offered expert commentary to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, Bloomberg, and many other publications. Dr. Sachs holds a doctorate in political science from Stanford. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sachs.
Thank you very much, David and Mike and the whole team. Thank you very much for having me. I hope you can hear me okay. It's a pleasure of sorts to join you. I'm sorry I'm doing it remotely. I say a pleasure of sorts just because of the time and the topic I cover. Obviously, there's very little pleasurable about this topic, especially in the last 6 months. The title of the topic is the talk today is about U.S. policy in the Middle East before and after this war, and I'll approach it with three different subtopics that I'll describe now. The first is on obviously the Palestinian-Israeli front, what we're seeing today, what we've seen in the past 6.5 months, and what that means going forward. The second is the regional aspect of this, and in particular, the potential for wider regional escalation between Israel and Hezbollah and Israel and Iran. And we saw some very dramatic, in fact, historic events on that front just in the past month. And finally, on the U.S. posture, where the United States administration here in Washington stands, where it stood before and where it stands today, and what it might be hoping to do. So, needless to say, anyone who's watching the news, and certainly anyone who took the time to attend today, knows the horrific events of the past 6.5 months, starting in particular on October 7th, with a very, very large scale and absolutely horrific terrorist attack by Hamas, invading Israel with thousands of troops and attacking not only military bases, but successfully attacking half a dozen civilian towns and villages and massacring their inhabitants. Since then, we've seen 6.5 months of war in Gaza that has been absolutely devastating in the Gaza Strip, leaving many, if not most, of the structures in the Gaza Strip in ruins, partial or full, and probably over 30,000 dead in the Gaza Strip, including, of course, many women and children. A massive toll, a massive level of devastation. This suggests that both parties in this moment have already suffered and are still suffering what really can only be described as generational historic traumas. We shouldn't mince words about this. I think those of us looking for paths forward, and that's literally our job here at Brookings, to try and think about actionable, practical policy recommendations for any administration to use going forward. We should be very clear-eyed about where we are right now. These kinds of generational traumas do not go away easily. They suggest, on the one hand, that true deep reconciliation is probably not available in the short term. I say this with deep personal grief. I grew up in Jerusalem, and this issue is very, very dear to my heart in every way. But I do think that deep historic reconciliation is not available right now. However, and this is the important point, that does not suggest by any means, that we can give up on improving what is right now an awful situation and could be considerably better, nor that peace, if we think of peace in slightly less lofty terms than the deep historic reconciliation and end of all hostilities, rather peace in the sense of no war, in the sense of no deaths, that is something we should certainly can and should strive for, and I think is available. From the start of the war, Israel was taken by dramatic surprise. The attack of October 7th was a colossal intelligence failure by the Israelis, and a colossal failure not only of intelligence, but of military preparedness, of the ability of the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, to withstand the attack and to protect civilians, not only in the first wave, but in 2 successive waves after that, and for many hours throughout the day of Saturday, October 7th, and with some Hamas fighters still hiding and fighting all the way into October 8th. This kind of failure will, as I said, not be forgotten for generations in Israel, and really represents the worst failure of Israel defense, probably in some ways worse even than 1973, which was the historic precedent when then Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on October 6, 1973, 50 years and 1 day prior, in what is known in Israel as the Yom Kippur War and the October War in Egypt. This kind of failure led Israel immediately to a very widespread consensus on the need to go after Hamas and on 2 objectives that Israel set for itself for this operation. The first was to bring down Hamas, but counter to what is often reported, it was not to evaporate Hamas into thin air or to create or to remove that idea of Hamas, the political party of Hamas, out of any existence. Rather, the clear instructions, written instructions to the IDF, were to remove Hamas as the governing power in the Gaza Strip, able to mount another assault like that and attack Israel and threaten Israeli civilians from the Gaza Strip. Hamas has been ruling the Gaza Strip since 2006 and alone since 2007, when it violently kicked out its Palestinian rival Fatah from joint government there. And Israel and Hamas have since then engaged in numerous rounds of fighting. Now, with the October 7th attack, Israel and Israelis writ large came to the conclusion they could no longer tolerate that reality, that Hamas could no longer govern a statelet, abutting Israel and able to attack Israeli civilians and conduct the massacre of the kind that we saw. The second was to free the hostages, as many of the hostages as possible, over 200 Israeli hostages captured by Hamas and taken into the Gaza Strip, some of them alive, some of them already killed inside Israel and their bodies taken in. Many of them apparently also already died in captivity. That was a very partially succeeded. We saw a deal, of course, months ago, a deal between Israel and Hamas that released some of the youngest children among those hostages, not all of them, but some of the youngest children, and some of the women, again, not all of them. And on the table right now, in intensive negotiations for quite a few weeks now, are more proposals for a new ceasefire, a longer ceasefire that would allow for the release of more hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. That is faltering, and it doesn't look today as if it's going to be reached imminently, but of course you never know with negotiations. What lacked in the Israeli strategy, so these were the 2 goals. I'll add one more point actually on this. From the very beginning, it was clear that there is a tension between these 2 goals. Removing Hamas did not contradict necessarily, but it was at least in tension with the possibility of freeing the hostages. That is because Hamas was, of course, using these hostages as human shields. Many of them were kept in tunnels sometimes with Hamas leadership as literally human shields to prevent Israeli attacks there. And giving them up for Hamas leaders would mean endangering themselves. And therefore, if they felt that they are going to be brought down, or in the case of the leadership of Hamas, killed, they would, of course, not relinquish their trump card in this regard, which was the hostages. Conversely, if you aim to release the hostages, you would probably have to have a deal with Hamas, as there was one in a short deal and potentially another one soon. Depending on negotiations, would of course entail concessions to Hamas and ones that might enable Hamas to sustain the attack and to remain, even if very weakened and greatly diminished after this war, still remain on its feet and able to project some power in the Gaza Strip. These two goals, at tension already, also lacked, to my mind, another very important goal, a strategically clear objective for what comes in the day after. The United States learned very much the hard way that counterinsurgency, learned especially in the surge in Iraq, entails not only capturing the territory, but then holding it effectively and then rebuilding it in an effort to prevent the insurgency to return to the same area it was in before. This was very much lacking in the Israeli military operation from the beginning, and we see some of the results already today, with Hamas returning to some of the areas that it previously controlled and lost to Israel. The most famous symbol of that was the Shifa Hospital in the Gaza City, in the Gaza Strip, which Israel had cleared. To much criticism, Hamas returned, and Israel again entered. The Israelis saw this as proof of their claim all along that Shifa was being used as a headquarters for Hamas, but it was also proof of another thing, which is the ability of Hamas to retake or re-enter into territory that was already ostensibly cleared, and in that regard, failure of counterinsurgency in the Israeli operation. The American position from the beginning on this was one that, on the one hand, adopted very much the Israeli objectives. President Biden came out as soon as the attack on October 7th happened and voiced not only very deep solidarity with Israelis, given the huge trauma they had suffered, but also identified himself with these two goals, with the idea that Hamas could no longer be allowed to project a threat from the Gaza Strip onto Israel. And secondly, the release of hostages, some of whom, of course, are also American citizens, as well as citizens of many other countries. In that regard, he stood very, very much beside Israel, but in other regards as well, in hard terms. A massive supply of munition and support from the United States came to Israel to help it in its campaign, something that he suffered political criticism about in his own party. And nonetheless, President Biden continued with this for many months, all the way till today. Of course, you may have seen the news just of this week of a withholding or a delay in some of the shipments, given disagreements now between the United States and Israel about the specific conduct of the war, and in particular the possibility of an Israeli operation in the very last stronghold of Hamas at the southern tip of the Gaza Strip, the city of Rafah, which abuts the Egyptian border with the Gaza Strip. And Israel entered in a very partial way so far along the border between Gaza and Egypt, all the way to what's known as the Rafah crossing, a civilian crossing above ground. Israel has strong suspicion that there are also underground tunnels between Gaza and the Sinai that have allowed Hamas to supply itself and resupply itself over the years. At the same time, the United States was doing something very different. It was not only trying to support Israel in this operation and not only taking this position that I mentioned, it was also thinking in its own right about what the day after would mean. So the United States from the beginning was pressuring Israel, although to conduct this operation, which it supported, to come up with a clear plan that would convince the Americans, American military and American policymakers, that Israel had a clear idea of where it was heading, what the day after might look like. And this vaunted day after became a very central theme in conversations here in Washington. The United States pressured Israel to postpone the ground operation in the Gaza Strip, and it did postpone it for several weeks. Air operations began almost immediately, but ground operations took considerably longer, and which also gave the Israeli Defense Forces time to plan. The Americans have since pressured the Israelis continuously to come up with clear ideas of what the day after might look like, both in terms of, sorry, I'm hearing myself, I hope everything's okay. Both in terms of what civilian rule in the Gaza Strip might look like and what the future of the structure, the government structure in the Gaza Strip might look like. I'll get back to this very soon. The second point the United States took upon itself immediately was a recognition, and I think a very correct recognition, that one of the most important policy goals, since the United States could not prevent, and in fact did not want to prevent, an Israeli attack on Hamas, was to prevent the dramatic escalation of this conflict into a far bigger regional conflict. Back in 2006, what Israel calls the Second Lebanon War, a very damaging war, especially for southern Lebanon, but also for Israel. That occurred in the context of a conflagration between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, where Hezbollah, the strongest force, a Shia force, and to some degree an Iranian proxy in Lebanon, joined the fight and opened a second front, a very large front, in what became a full-fledged war. The suspicion from Israel from the very first moment was that this is Hamas's hope, that Hezbollah, which is far stronger than Hamas and supplied by Iran with a whole country, Lebanon, to operate from, that they would be joining the fight and Israel would find itself in a two-front war, not only with Hamas, but as I said, with a far stronger Hezbollah. Hezbollah is far stronger both because it has a very large number of rockets compared to a smaller number by Hamas, but also because the nature of these rockets is very different. Hezbollah has managed to transform at least some of them into precise missiles that can hit in a very small radius and could hit in terms of range probably almost anywhere in Israel. That would put millions of Israelis, essentially all the Israeli population, under threat, but more importantly, under threat of very precise attacks in very large numbers. These could potentially overwhelm Israeli missile defenses and shut down the country or shut down essential services in the country at least temporarily. Israel's small. It's about the size of New Jersey. And so if you think of someone with precise munitions trying to shut down an area the size of New Jersey, it would not be very hard. You would hit you would hit the turnpike, you would hit bridges, you would hit energy installations, water installations, and the state of Israel could be shut down. Of course, military targets would be easy to target as well. Given that, Israel also had a strong incentive, of course, to preemptively strike, to try to take out some of Hezbollah's strongest capabilities before it struck. And this is something that concerned the Americans very much. When President Biden spoke immediately after the attack, he warned any state or any organization, which everyone understood very clearly to mean Iran, any state, or Hezbollah, any organization, from joining into the fight. And he said, I have one word for you, don't. And he repeated, don't. And this was a clear warning that was also followed by the deployment of an aircraft carrier group to the Mediterranean and then a second aircraft carrier group to the region. These were meant as a show of force and a clear demonstration that the United States would itself get involved if Iran, or more likely Hezbollah, would attack Israel, and that Israel would not in that case stand alone in a two-front or multi-front war if Iran joined as well. In that regard, the United States has been far more successful than its goals in the Gaza Strip. And it's worth remembering this, the regional war that we have not seen yet, we've seen a lot regionally, but we have not seen a full-fledged war, owes itself probably to calculations by Hezbollah and Iran that it's not the time they want to do it, but it certainly also owes to a very effective deterrence by the United States and a show of force by the United States that dissuaded them from any temptation to do it. Nonetheless, we should be clear, there is an active war going on between Hezbollah and Israel with many deaths already. It is far short of what could be, far short of a full-fledged war that would be absolutely devastating for Lebanon and, as I mentioned before, very damaging for Israel as well. We've also seen, of course, conflagration with Iran, which I'll get to in a moment. But in this regard, the Biden administration has been more successful, and a lot of its effort have been regarding this. So first on Lebanon. One of the main lessons that Israelis learned from October 7th is that they cannot tolerate an armed militia capable of attacking Israeli towns, sitting deployed and stating its intention to invade right meters away sometimes from Israeli towns and villages. That is true of Hamas and hence the operation in the Gaza Strip, but the same logic is true of Hezbollah in the north. Hezbollah has been deployed along the Lebanese-Israeli border, in contradiction to UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which ended the 2006 war, and Israeli villages that are sometimes right on the border, on the fence itself, are therefore vulnerable to attack by Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has made clear for many years now its intention to fight the next war in Israeli territory and to capture Israeli towns. It dug tunnels across the border that Israel exposed years ago. There could be more tunnels that Israel doesn't know about. And there are certainly Hezbollah plans and intentions to invade Israel. And therefore, the Israeli position was that Hezbollah must withdraw in accordance with Resolution 1701 across the Litani River, which varies in its distance from the Israeli border, but in some cases is considerably far from the a dozen or more kilometers from the Israeli border. And that is important, especially given some of the short-range rockets that Hezbollah has. That kind of distance would be actually meaningful. It would also give, of course, much more time for defenses to organize if an invasion were coming. This is something that at least has a diplomatic route. Here there is a very clear demand in the United States. The White House in particular has been working hard on trying to find agreement between the parties, indirectly with Hezbollah itself and with Israel, on what resolution might look like, what kind of redeployment by Hezbollah would satisfy the Israelis, and in what context that could happen. That has not reached any conclusion, of course, although there are considerable efforts with the Americans, also the French, who have a lot of sway in Lebanon. They're the former colonial power there. If there were a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, or if the war there ended, and it's already winding down, but if it ended, perhaps we could see a calm returning to the northern border, but it's a tenuous calm. An errant missile or rocket that hit and killed a large number of civilians on either side could easily escalate into a full-fledged Lebanese, or I should say Hezbollah-Israel war. The price would be paid by Israeli civilians, but also very much so by Lebanese civilians, whether they are Hezbollah supporters or not. In the broader sense, we've seen history. Israel and Iran for many years now have conducted a shadow war. And as many people have commented in mid-April, the night between April 13th and 14th, that shadow war came out of the shadows and into the open. Israel and Iran have been targeting each other over a variety of things. Iran has been trying to stow unrest among Palestinians, as I said, among Lebanese, with the creation of Hezbollah and its support for many years. Now with support of the Houthis in Yemen, who have been attacking shipping in the Red Sea. This has been a long-standing effort by Iran, not only against Israel, against other powers in the region, other countries in the region that Iran views itself exporting its revolution towards, but certainly against Israel. And Israel has been targeting Iranians, both the Iranian nuclear program inside Iran and its efforts to resupply Hezbollah and other militia in Syria, to a lesser degree in Iraq, and of course in Lebanon. This war, however, has always been in the shadows, in the sense that the parties have always reserved deniability. Even when there was a strike, they could claim it was not them in some regards. The latest escalation happened when Israel targeted the Iranian consulate, or an annex to the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing a very senior leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is the export arm of the revolution of the Iranian military, in this case into Syria, and killing that general. Iran then retaliated, as I said, on April 13th with a very large barrage of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. This was on the one hand broadcast, and in that case ahead of time to a certain degree, and in that sense there was time for defenses to prepare. But we should make no mistake, this was not a performance alone. This was a very large attack. Had those numbers of missiles gotten through, they would have easily devastated the Israeli air base they were targeting, the Nevatim air base in the south. And so that was history number one. We saw a dramatic, direct attack from Iranian territory by Iranian forces against Israel and targeting Israel. The distance is long. Of course, Israel and Iran do not border each other by any means. And so there were a couple of hours, in some cases, of Israelis waiting for the missiles to show up from Iran and enter back into the atmosphere and come down. But there were two other historic events. The second was that the United States, along with regional partners, Arab regional partners, coordinated a defense to shoot down this barrage of missiles of various kinds. And that included the Jordanian Air Force, which shot down the UAVs in Jordanian airspace. Jordan is just to the east of Israel. And so many of the UAVs were crossing through Jordan and therefore violating its own airspace. But it also included intelligence sharing by Gulf countries, Arab Gulf countries, alongside the United States and the UK and others. In this regard, we saw a coalition, a Western Arab coalition, engaged in an operation to defend Israel. And that is, again, historic. We've seen the increasing closeness between Israel and some Arab countries, especially in the Gulf, in recent years. And a central part of that logic was a joint opposition to Iran, a joint fear of Iran. But here we had an orchestration by the United States of defense of Israel, including Arab armies. As I said, that is truly historic and lays the groundwork for potential regional integration in the future. It's also the culmination of an effort by Central Command, the US CENTCOM, based in Florida. CENTCOM has included the Middle East for many years, but it did not include Israel for many years because the Arab states objected to any joint operations with Israel. Several years ago, Israel moved from the area of operation of EUCOM, European Command, to CENTCOM alongside the Arab countries. And CENTCOM is the one that coordinated this with this vision for several years now of creating an integrated regional defense, whether it's formal or informal. In this regard, it was informal, but very effective. Finally, this coalition, but also the Israeli defenses themselves, the missile defenses, were extremely successful. And that should be noted. It is not a given shooting down such a large number of projectiles, especially the ballistic missiles, which are very hard to target. And the Israeli defenses, not only the Iron Dome, which we've heard a lot about, that is for short-range missiles, such as those coming from the Gaza Strip and some of those coming from Lebanon, but also high-altitude defenses, especially the Arrow 3, which targets ballistic missiles outside the atmosphere. The success rate of both those systems, there's also a third intermediate system, but the success of those on the night of April 13th was remarkable. It was essentially, it's close to 100%. And although very expensive to operate, very expensive, it is a remarkable success and an important show of force. So that's, in a sense, history number 3. We should not be taking that for granted either. Let me conclude my remarks before we go to Q&A, which I'm eager to hear much more than myself. A little bit about where the U.S. was before October 7th and where it stands today, what it hopes to do in the region. So long before October 7th, months before, the United States has been hoping to create a regional architecture that would build on just this kind of effort that we saw on April 13th, but the cornerstone of which would be Israeli-Saudi normalization of relations. This would build on the Abraham Accords that were signed during the Trump administration between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and to a lesser degree Sudan, that formalized normal relations between these countries. These were not peace treaties in the sense that these countries were not technically enemies, and they do not border each other, of course, but they were very significant, especially the Israeli-UAE relationship. And they were seen as a harbinger, perhaps, of broader normalization between much of the Arab world and Israel. Israel already had peace treaties with Egypt since the late 70s and with Jordan since the 1990s, and now it had normal full relations with several key other Arab countries. The big question remaining was Saudi Arabia, of course. That was the big prize yet remaining. The fact that Bahrain joined the Abraham Accords was a signal that Saudi Arabia approved of them. Bahrain is very closely aligned with Saudi policy, much more so than other Gulf countries, even the UAE. But Saudi Arabia still remained on the sidelines. Under Biden, the United States was hoping to push, just like the Trump administration was hoping to, for Israeli-Saudi normalization. And in this regard, it was doing two things. First, it was changing somewhat its emphasis away from the Middle East. Since 2008, under the Obama administration, the United States has been hoping to recalibrate its efforts, rebalance its efforts towards Asia and away from the Middle East, where Obama judged the United States was overinvested during the George W. Bush years. It was only partially successful under Obama. He was heavily engaged in Israeli-Palestinian affairs and then in Syrian affairs and in Libyan affairs. Under Trump, there was a different version of that, but certainly a lessening of the U.S. commitment to security in the Middle East. And nonetheless, Trump was still very engaged in the Middle East. His first visit was to Riyadh. Under Biden, in the first couple of years, we genuinely did see a pivot away from the Middle East. We saw the United States fundamentally view China as the pacing challenge, the one that would determine U.S. defense posture in many regards. After the invasion of Ukraine, the second invasion of Ukraine, we saw an enormous effort in Europe, of course, with the Middle East a tertiary region at best, and in their Israeli-Palestinian affairs, which used to be the center of policy there, low on the rung. With these efforts on normalization, we did see Arab-Israeli affairs coming back. After October 7th, of course, Israeli-Palestinian affairs came back very much to the center of policymaking in the United States, occupying an enormous amount of time of decision makers at the highest level, including the president himself. But we also saw a re-engagement, a continuation of this fundamental judgment that the United States would like to promote Saudi-Israeli normalization, and this time viewing it as a key also for the day after in the Gaza Strip, with the grand bargain, as we might call it, of the Biden administration being Israeli-Saudi normalization that would allow the Saudis and the Emiratis to get involved in Palestinian affairs with some clear horizon towards a two-state solution and an independent Palestinian state that would then allow them also to help rebuild the Gaza Strip financially and politically, and would allow for an unwinding of this war, hopefully, towards something positive going forward. This would be very difficult. The Saudi-Israeli normalization would entail major commitments by the United States, especially two. One, the Saudis have been demanding a defense pact, a formal defense pact between the United States and Saudi Arabia, something akin to NATO, or at least to the pacts in East Asia, the Japanese or the Korean. That would be something that politically would not be easy to do in the United States, and as a formal treaty would require a supermajority in the Senate, at least 67 senators voting in favor of that. It would necessarily have to be bipartisan. It's not an easy lift, but something that the Biden administration has been hoping to do. And we may see either Biden or Trump pick up in the next term, certainly. The second big element was a commitment by the United States to help Saudi Arabia with a civilian nuclear program that would include, the Saudis demanded at least initially, enrichment of uranium, which they have their own uranium, but enrichment of uranium on Saudi soil, something that is very risky from the American perspective in terms of non-proliferation. The fear, of course, is that what begins as a civilian nuclear program could one day become a military nuclear program if relations sour, or if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, and Saudi Arabia views that obviously as a big threat, that this could be a gambit that is risky down the road. Fear that the Israelis have as well. They are very eager, extremely eager, for normalization with Saudi Arabia, but some of them at least have quite a bit of fear about this nuclear aspect. And finally, there are the third element, which are issues of technology, and especially the question of technology sharing with China, something the United States is hoping that Saudi Arabia will limit and pivot towards an American orbit in that regard as well. I'll just end by saying this grand bargain is still on the table. We've heard very recently Secretary Blinken, who was visiting Riyadh, the Saudi foreign minister, and others talk about this, but it is very complicated. It's very complicated in terms of American politics, certainly in an election year. It's very complicated with regard to the Gaza Strip, where the war is not completely over. And it would be very complicated in terms of dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, given all the details that I just said, and the substantive difficulties on the nuclear front, but others as well, of reaching such a bargain. Nonetheless, it would offer, in theory at least, a path forward. Why don't I pause there, and David, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Doctor. A very informative and instructive presentation. Really looking forward. Really looking forward to some great questions, not just from our members, but from our students as well. Dave Carroll, former past president, has a microphone, and he's going to circulate throughout the room. I certainly invite any of our Zoom participants to send your questions in via the chat function, and I will read them and pass them along to Dr. Sachs. Questions? Let's see some hands.
Okay, let's start off with Rodney. One question, Rodney. I hold the mic.
You've indicated what could happen, Professor. What do you actually think is going to happen in the next few months and then the next few years in the Middle East, if you had to nail down a position paper, say?
You have 20 minutes, Professor?
So it's an excellent question, and of course a difficult one. So let me say that some of the things that I feel more confident in saying, and some of them where there's much more uncertainty, and I don't know the answer, of course. I don't have a crystal ball. So the first is that the fundamentals of this conflict are unfortunately rather stable. The Israeli-Palestinian arena, as I indicated before, a lot can be done, and I think a lot should be done urgently. We could move toward a calmer future, a less awful future, but the fundamentals of this conflict are not going away. I do not expect an end of this conflict in terms of a two-state solution that ends everything in short order, in part because the parties themselves are so far apart and because the events of October 7th and the months since then have moved them farther apart still. Israelis are extremely fearful of the idea of security concessions to Palestinians. They believe that if the Palestinians had control not only of the Gaza Strip, but also of the West Bank, which is right by all the centers of population inside most of Israel, not only the villages in the south, like the Gaza Strip, that would put millions of Israelis in danger of a horrific fate like they saw on October 7th, and would be extremely unstable and would entail the Israeli reoccupation of the West Bank in short order. The Palestinians, given seeing some of their worst fears come to fruition here in the last few months and even today, are in less mood for any historic reconciliation with Israel than they were before. And the idea that any kind of diplomatic solution would quell historic grievances or disappear Hamas support, and Hamas, of course, completely opposed to the idea of peace with Israel, I think is fanciful. Nonetheless, you can move toward a structure that would offer at least a diplomatic framework in which to work. And as I said, peace, if it's considered properly, a small lowercase p, not capital P, grand reconciliation, that is possible. And that can be done even if hostile feelings remain, and even if people still hold on to dreams of the other side disappearing, you nonetheless can have peace. There are many cases of this in the world. I like to point to Cyprus, which is very close. In Cyprus, there is a border crossing Nicosia, the capital. The northern part of Cyprus is occupied according to the Greeks there and to the European Union. There is a Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus that no one besides Turkey recognizes. All this suggests a conflict that is not resolved. And nonetheless, and there are refugees that have not returned home. Nonetheless, if you count the number of people who have died in the Cyprus conflict in the past year or 5 years, the number is 0. And so I will take a Cyprus model, even if it is well short of grand reconciliation. That's in terms of their fundamentals of the Iranian-Israeli conflict, the Iranian-Arab conflict are also, unfortunately, structural. I don't think they're going away. I do not see any chance of reconciliation between this Iranian regime as it's currently constituted and the West writ large. Hostility to the West and to Israel, and to a lesser degree to many of the Sunni Arab states, is foundational for this Iranian regime. In the past, there have been other voices in the regime, all the way back in 2000 in particular. But since then, those reform movements have been crushed, and the variations that we see in the Iranian regime are much smaller than between true reformers and others. We may one day see more fundamental change in Iran. That could happen, but I would certainly not predict that in the short term. And of course, I believe it should come organically, not from anyone from the outside. So now to your question. So here are things that I think are fundamental. Where is there more uncertainty? Well, there's much more uncertainty on the leadership, especially among Israelis and Palestinians. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is extremely unpopular in Israel right now. He is seen by many in the Israeli voting public as responsible for October 7th. He was not only the Prime Minister on that day, he was also the Prime Minister in 13 of the 14 years prior to that. He was the man in charge of the whole approach to Hamas, of keeping Hamas deterred but there while weakening the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, Hamas's rival. And if polls are correct, and if elections were held today, he would lose probably quite handily. However, elections are not being held today. They are not scheduled for almost 3 years from now. And so he may be in place for quite a while. This is where I say there's a lot of uncertainty. There's many reasons to believe he could be replaced, but he has shown absolutely every indication that he intends to cling to power. And at the moment, he still commands a majority in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. And so long as he has that majority, he can remain in power. On the Palestinian side, there's enormous uncertainty. Palestinian body politic is in shambles, in suffering, as I said, a trauma, and one that really points to a future that's very uncertain. The leader of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is well into his 80s and has ruled over authority that's become ossified and corrupt and extremely unpopular among its own people, whereas Hamas has shown its true colors in recent months. And I would just caution, I do not expect longevity of any of those leaders if Israel has anything to say about it. And so the future of Palestinian leadership remains in play. There are, of course, other figures. There are figures especially of the Fatah party, the party of Mahmoud Abbas, of the Palestinian Authority, who could emerge to the front, but it is very hard at this point to say who they are. And these questions could be crucial. With different leadership among Israelis and among Palestinians, again, I don't think beautiful harmony is breaking out any day soon, but you could see a very different trajectory with different leadership, more pragmatic leadership on both sides and more capable leadership on the Palestinian side. I think a lot could be done, and the United States and perhaps the grand bargain with Saudi Arabia and all that entails would also become a lot more feasible.
David, I think we have a student question.
Yes, we do have a student question here now. Please identify your school and your name, please.
My name is Larisbal. I attend Muhlenberg High School. What is your opinion on the protest that is happening across the country, especially on college campuses? Do you think that these students who support Palestine are misinformed about what really is happening in the Gaza war?
That's a great question, and in the sense that it's a very hard one. So first, I very much support people protesting for what they believe, and I know some protesters, and I think certainly some of them view this as solidarity with people in extreme duress, and certainly the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are in extreme duress. I do think, however, that when you hear so many very different voices and very different slogans coming out, the message that is portrayed from these protests is very different from simply support for Palestine. Support for Palestine, to my mind, would be clearly in opposition to support for Hamas. Hamas is the one that has brought Palestinians to this moment. We should remember Hamas could have ended this war at any day and could end it today too. It simply would have to release the hostages and disarm. And it need not disarm to Israel. It could disarm to the Egyptians, to the Palestinian Authority, to the UN, to anyone else, and could have ended that war. And so support for Palestine or for Palestinians, to my mind, would entail opposition to Hamas. And it would entail support for a ceasefire that it was a serious ceasefire. That was not simply Israel holding its fire and waiting for the next Hamas attack, but an actual future that included the Palestinian Authority, that included a two-state solution. So when you hear slogans such as "from the river to the sea," and the river to the sea means not only all of the Palestinian territories, it means all of Israel. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That means very clearly to every Israeli, they have no deliberations about it. That means no Israel. And that means war. That means existential war, which is precisely the terrible situation we're in right now. So to the degree that slogans exacerbate this sense of existential fight, I think they're not only deeply misinformed, they also exacerbate the problem. They make Israelis view this war as existential, and they strengthen Palestinian voices who view the same, who believe that for them to have a better future, which of course they deserve, and independence, which I believe they certainly deserve, that means the eradication of Israel or the expulsion of 7 or 8 million Jews from Israel. This kind of notion is first not going to happen, and secondly is morally abhorrent to my mind. So what do I feel about the protests? It depends which protester, depends what protest. I very much support the right to protest, of course. I also support those who coming out in solidarity with those who are suffering. I wish they had solidarity for all those who are suffering and not only one side, but be that as it may. But I have no patience and no understanding of those who use that kind of platform to call for essentially the murder of other people.
We have another student question here. Name and school?
My name is Benjamin. I go to Twin Valley, and I was wondering, with Sunni Arab states moving more towards Israel and the United States in policy, given their historical support for Palestine, what concessions or agreements would the United States and Israel expect to have to make for their continued support? And how would the Sunni Arabs, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE's connection with Palestine, who's also Sunni Arab, how would that come into effect?
That's an excellent question. So even before October 7th, we at Brookings were heavily involved with just this question. What is, or what should be, the Palestinian component of a grand bargain be? And this is because the Abraham Accords, which the UAE signed, essentially punted on the Palestinian issue. For many years, the Palestinians have viewed support from the Arab countries and Arab refusal to normalize relations with Israel as one of their main points of leverage. That if Israel wanted to be accepted in the region, it would have to concede independence to the Palestinians, or in the past, they would have thought Israel has to disappear. And today, again, quite a few people suggest that. And then the Abraham Accords were received as a gut punch by the Palestinians, because here were the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, normalizing relations with Israel with essentially very little concession to the Palestinian issue. The only real concession was that Israel was deferring the possibility of officially annexing parts of the West Bank to Israel. So Israel was avoiding doing something, and that was it. And in that regard, the Palestinians were irate and remain irate with the UAE, and the relations between many of the Palestinian leaders and the UAE are dismal. Certainly Hamas, which is antithetical to much of what the UAE believes in, but also the Palestinian Authority. The UAE has supported for a long time a rival Fatah leader. His name is Mohammed Dahlan, and he lives in Abu Dhabi. Someone whom Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian leader, has kicked out of their party and shunned because of this sort of potential challenge. The question then came to Saudi Arabia. UAE can do many things in terms of public opinion that Saudi Arabia cannot, because the UAE is much, much smaller. It has very few citizens. Most of the people who live there are not citizens, in fact. They're guest workers. Saudi Arabia is very different. It has a large population. It views itself as a leader not only of the Arab but of the Muslim world, as home to the two holy sites of Mecca and Medina, and has historically been a staunch supporter of the Palestinian cause. In the distant past, it supported Hamas. In more recent years, it has shunned away from radical Islamism, at least in the Muslim Brotherhood style, and has adopted more support for the secular Palestinian factions, but in recent years, less than. What that would entail is an open question, and one that people in Washington are asking all the time. What they're talking about right now is rather amorphous, but a clear path with a timetable towards a two-state solution, in other words, a Palestinian state. How exactly does that become an irreversible path, as they call it? How does it become irreversible is an open question. Few things are actually irreversible, but you would imagine that it would entail a reform of the Palestinian Authority, a Palestinian Authority that would then get a governing role in the Gaza Strip, and that would gain more authority over territory in the West Bank, not only the Gaza Strip, with a clear aim toward recognition of a Palestinian state by the international community, perhaps the United States itself. The United States has floated this, as has the United Kingdom and others. And so a path that, in some minds at least, is an irreversible path towards a Palestinian state. I'll note a crucial question here is whether it is a demilitarized Palestinian state. In other words, does it have armored tanks? Does it have an armored corps able to threaten Israel? How powerful is it? And how fearful would Israelis therefore be of it? The more fearful they are of it, the less likely they are to, of course, agree to its creation or vouch for its stability in the long term. The more threatened they are, the less likely they are to concede. This is, again, goes back to the protest question. The more you convince them that this is an existential question and that for Palestine to be free, Israel must be eradicated, the less likely it is that Palestine will ever be free, which is something I hope it will be. And So this path is a difficult one. It's not a simple one, and it's especially a difficult one in this time. But in theory, that is what is in the cards: an attempt to solidify a path towards a two-state solution. The devil, as always, is in the details. Any kind of process becomes susceptible to spoilers on both sides. It can be quite difficult to proceed on if and when spoilers emerge.
I think we have time for one more question. So who's it going to be? Amongst the three of you, flip. I'm going to go with you first. First and last question.
Dr. Yan, my name is Matt. My question is, have you read any reporting regarding how could Israel be so unprepared on October 7? And if you have, what is that reporting indicating?
Sure, it's a great question. It's an open question in Israel. Of course, already on October 7th, Israelis, from the very first hours, were absolutely shocked. I happened to be awake at 1:30 a.m. because I have a baby. And so I was following events in real time. And I have to say, it was very hard to believe my own eyes, seeing Hamas fighters roaming around Israeli towns. And more importantly, the Israeli military taking so many hours to effectively clear them out. What we do know is a combination of a few things. First, Israelis were looking for what was the faulty paradigm in terms of intelligence that they had. And they turned to this because in 1973, this is the judgment that Israel came to after the war, that Israel had a faulty paradigm. And that paradigm in intelligence sense then was that Egypt would not attack Israel until it had air superiority, until it could operate in the air as well, and it could not in October 73, and that Syria would not attack without Egypt. Therefore, the surprise attack caught Israel by surprise. This time, there was another faulty paradigm. There was the belief that Hamas was deterrable and that its main interest was to govern the Gaza Strip and allow more prosperity in the Gaza Strip. Israel and Egypt had put a blockade of varying severity on Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip since Hamas took control of the Strip. And in recent months and years before October 7th, Israel had been easing that blockade with the hope that this was incentivizing Hamas to govern over a slightly more prosperous Gaza Strip and leading toward some kind of normalization, modus vivendi. Not that there would be any peace between Israel and Hamas. Hamas is obviously not interested in that, but that they would want to have a deterred and livable kind of situation between them. That obviously turned out to be a faulty assumption. It was a very strong assumption, one that Israelis throughout the intelligence community conveyed. I heard that repeatedly just the prior December in a major conference and private conversations in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and obviously it was faulty. So that was a failure of intelligence. And there were a variety of operational reasons also for lack of real intelligence, although there were warnings, and the warnings were not properly appreciated. So there was actually a plan uncovered for something that looked like October 7th, but it did not go up the intelligence chains as it should have. There was a failure of operations here, perhaps akin even to 9/11, where the United States learned a lot of things. As you know, there were signs available to the American intelligence community of what was being planned on 9/11, but it was not shared widely enough across the intelligence community, not digested properly and brought up the chain. So to a certain degree, it's similar. Of course, the Israeli intelligence community is smaller, but nonetheless. The second issue is the lack of preparation. And there are a variety of operational failures, both in terms of the number of troops that were simply there, their preparedness, but also the quickness with which the military responded. I'll note one of the most banal issues is that this was conducted on purpose, of course, early Saturday morning. So Israel, that would be in Israel, Saturday is kind of like Sunday. It's the day of rest. And in the military too, there are many people who are home on leave on Saturday, much more than they would be on a Tuesday, including many commanders. And moreover, this was a holy day. This was Simchat Torah, so one of the high holidays of the fall. And so even more so, there were people simply not there. It took quite a while for them to come back. Even pilots coming to man the helicopters had to drive from their homes to the airbase, get in the helicopter, and then show up on the scene. And once they were there, Hamas had succeeded in taking out the commanders in the region. It succeeded in taking out the brigade and battalion commanders, literally killing them, so that there were not people on the ground to coordinate the airstrikes that would have stopped some of the massacres in the kibbutzim and the towns. And so there are reports, for example, I heard a report from a helicopter pilot who said, we simply did not know who to target. We didn't know if these were civilians or these were Hamas people in some instances, which is very hard to do, and therefore we couldn't shoot. And had the command structure been in place. So there are a lot of very gut-wrenching lessons to be learned in terms of intelligence failure, the ability of Hamas to coordinate a complex and very successful plan to shut down the early warning systems that still existed with UAVs or drones, to attack the military bases with large enough numbers that would allow other forces to enter, massacre, rape, and murder everyone they could find, and kidnap others. And finally, what took so long for the military to show up? As you can see, the answers are very partial. I'll just note, however, that amid all of that, there were also enormous stories of heroism. There were soldiers, there's a story of one tank actually manned by female soldiers who had come from a base farther south and had single-handedly diverted some of the Hamas fighters in enormous fighting and probably saved many civilians in one of the kibbutzim in the south. There are stories, not stories, there's evidence of what's known as the auxiliary unit inside. So inside small villages, there will be civilians who are tasked with picking up arms if there is an attack. So they are the rapid response force. And they are usually people who in reserve duty will be serving in a good unit or something. And then there is one civilian there who is in fact working for the military and is in charge of that. And in some of the villages, they managed with enormous bravery and often giving their lives to save others. I don't want to get too gruesome, but there's one gut-wrenching story of an elderly man who, with his family, including young kids, was hiding in the secure room, the room that is more secure from rockets. There were thousands of rockets being shot. And when he realized that Hamas were in the building, or in the home, it's a single home, he stepped out and he sat in the living room and pretended to be someone who lived alone. And he gave his life, of course, but he saved his family. And these stories go on and on. There are many, many of these stories. So among a horrific failure, a truly shameful failure, there are also stories of heroism. It's the very little one can see in what is a very grim reality, both on that day in Israel and of course in the horrific months since then in very closely neighboring Gaza Strip.
So we need to end our questioning at this point. Doctor, I want to thank you for sharing your perspective with us today. Very informative. I have a gift that I'm going to be mailing to you. So we have a commemorative plate that's made for the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading that's embossed with our seal. I will be mailing that to you down at Brookings with our thanks for you joining us today and presenting to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for attending, and I'm sorry for the somber note.